Hi there, welcome to the Upcycle Design Lab. My name's Cindy and I craft using recycled and repurposed materials. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around and check out some of my other upcycling tutorials. And if you like what you see, you can check the subscribe button below any of my videos to become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to be notified when I upload new videos, be sure to check the bell icon as well. So today I'm going to be starting part 5 of my quilt project, and if you've missed any of the other episodes, you can get to those in the comment section of this video. But today we're going to be actually doing some hand quilting. And if you missed the story, some friends of mine gave me a bunch of t-shirts and they wanted me to make them a quilt, and I'm finally getting around to it, so I've made it to the point where I'm ready to quilt. Before we get started quilting, I just wanted to recap what I did in the first 4 videos. So in video 1, I talked about my inspiration and drawing out a sketch and a plan. I also made some letter blocks, which I called 2-part blocks, and then the pieces were cut out and laid out to make sure that I liked where all the pieces were. In video 2, I did the stabilizing of all the blocks using a couple of different products. And then all of the blocks were cut to the exact sewing size using a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. I also assembled the 2-part blocks using the adhesive and then top stitching the pieces together. In video 3, I worked with some of my problem blocks to fix some of the flaws using a pen technique, a stitching technique, and an applique technique. Then I was ready to finally start sewing all of the blocks together, so I built the quilt, and then using a sheet and some batting, I laid all the layers together and did the pin basting. In the 4th video, I kind of switched gears because I knew I wanted to hand quilt my quilt, and so I bought some PVC pipe and some connectors to make my own quilting frame. So here's a look at the tools and materials that I will be using in this video. Here's a shot of the quilt on the quilting frame, and originally I was trying to kind of keep my quilt completely off the floor, so I had all this elaborate tying system to try to keep it out of the way, but the easiest way to keep it off the floor is just to kind of keep it folded. You can see I've got the back folded onto the quilt frame. You can't really reach the entire frame anyway, so I'm going to be working on the orange and gray blocks that are just above the word louder. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my tape template on there, and then I will get some matching thread and do a little bit of stitching. So I'm going to move a little bit closer here for the next shot. So I'm going to be working on this gray block here, and I want to go ahead and put my template down. So I'm using a very simple straight pattern, and I'm just using wide painter's tape. Because I want to stitch on both sides of my painter's tape to make my pattern. So that's my general pattern. I'm going to stitch around the outside and then around the inside of the painter's tape here. And here's a quick look at the templates that I used for the other sizes of blocks that I have in my quilt. So I have I'm using sort of a matching thread for all of my blocks. So I have quite a few different thread colors, but you do want to make sure you have the quilter's heavyweight thread. And you're going to want a thimble. Now what I found was that I wasn't really able to do a normal stitch, I guess, because a lot of the quilters have you do more than one stitch at a time. but I'm not really able to do that. I have to do sort of an underhand and overhand type of stitch. This is a sewing tip that I learned a while ago, and it's just kind of about relaxing the thread. So you can see it's pretty curly here. I'm just going to run my fingers over it about 3 or 4 times and just untwist it slightly. And this will help keep the thread from getting tangled. Now to start the thread, you want to just do a single knot. And you want to trim pretty close to where your knot is, so you only have maybe 1/8 of an inch of a tail left. And then you want to just feed the needle between the 2 layers of your quilt. And you want a fairly long stitch, and then you're gonna, once you get to where the knot is caught, you're gonna give your thread a little tug. This part always makes me nervous, but you're gonna give your thread just a little tug, and you bury the knot inside between the 2 layers, kind of in the batting that you have in the center of your quilt. And then you're ready to start stitching. Now, like I said, some people have you do sort of try to catch multiple stitches at one time. I was not able to do that at all. So, like I said, I do sort of an under and over stitch. Now the thing of it is that you want your dominant hand underneath, and I'm right-handed, so I'm going to put my right hand under the quilt, and I'm going to feed my first stitch through with my left hand, and then I'll feed the stitch back up through with my dominant hand. Just trying to go right along the tape, keeping my stitches fairly even. One thing I found is that a lot of times I like to leave my top stitch a little bit loose, if you can see that here, so that I can make sure that I'm coming back up. Sometimes it's hard to see exactly where your last stitch was, so you can see where you're coming back up and make sure that you have sort of a very similar stitch size, and then you can tug it tight when you're up to the top. So now I can see exactly where my thread came out, so I can make sure that I'm putting the needle in sort of an even distance away, and then I'm holding the loop so that I can come back up in a similar stitch size. And once again, I'll just pull 2 stitches tight at the same time. You don't have to do that. If you can see where your last stitch was, you can certainly just pull each stitch tight as you go. But I just found it a little easier to make my stitches more uniform if I could make sure I could see where that last stitch was. So this does take some time, but it's kind of a relaxing activity. And it's very fun when you get to pull the tape off and see all of your stitching. You do definitely want to think about your pattern before you start stitching, and you're going to want to make sure that you're decide what kind of thread color you want to use on it. And of course, if you're a perfectionist, you might want to use your sewing machine. I don't know. I've certainly had some different stitch sizes throughout my stitching here, but overall I think it looks pretty neat and tidy. You want to keep your stitches as uniform as possible, but they certainly are tough to get perfect. The tape helps you keep things a little straighter. But sometimes it makes the stitches hard to see, so that's why I like to leave my loop here like this. So I've finished quilting about 12 of the blocks in the center because I started in the center of my quilt and I'm kind of working out to the edges. You can see my square pattern here on some of the blocks. And then I also stitched around each of the letters to add some texture to the letter blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back on the quilting frame and continue quilting. Almost done with the quilting. I have about 12 squares left, but I did have some additional thoughts that some things kind of that I've learned along the way and just some observations. First of all, I just wanted to mention that it is really fun to see the different texture. Hopefully you can see this, but the quilting just adds a lot of texture. So you can see that I've quilted around the edge of this square, and then I also quilted around the letter, and it just adds a lot of dimension. I'm not sure how much of this shows up in the video, but the E has not been quilted yet, and you can just see that it's a lot flatter. So it is fun to see the dimension that you get out of the quilting itself. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is knots, because they can be very aggravating, certainly when you are sewing, especially if you get a knot on the bottom of the quilt. It is particularly problematic to deal with. So a couple of tips that I have for that is that you can go back and relax the thread again. If it starts twisting as you're sewing through the stitches, you can go back and just put the needle down to the down to the quilt, and then run your fingers along the thread to relax it again, and that can help keep some of the twisting to a minimum. So I mentioned this before about just kind of leaving a loop on the top. This also helps, it helps you see the stitch, but it also helps you to keep knots from missing knots on the bottom. So if you keep a loop on the top and you come back up from the bottom, as long as you're able to pull that loop through, you should be fairly certain that you do not have a knot on the bottom of your quilt. Now, you can also run your finger along it just to make sure that you don't have any knots, but I think the best way to do it is just to make sure that you have thread on the top, that if you're able to pull all the way through on your second stitch, you should be fairly certain that you don't have a knot on the bottom. Now, sometimes you're going to end up with a knot anyway, and in some cases I've decided I didn't catch them soon enough, so I just have decided to live with them. There aren't any that are too terrible, but like I said, you probably are going to have some flaws on the back of your quilt that you miss, especially if you're a beginner like I am. But in some cases where I've caught a knot and I couldn't get it out, a lot of times if you catch the knot at the bottom, before you pull it too tight, you can kind of loosen it up. And what I've found is that if you're able to pull the loose tail through, probably you're not going to end up with a knot, because most of the time it's this little tail that gets wrapped around the other thread. And if you're able to get it loose, you can usually pull the 2 stitches tight all the way through and not have a knot on the bottom. If sometimes you're not able to do that, and I had to actually just kind of give up and cut my thread off and pull out some stitches and just tie them off and start over with a new strand of thread. So as long as you're catching the knots before you get too far along with the stitching, you should be able to correct most of the problems. The other thing that I found was that I'm using a lot of different thread colors because I'm trying to kind of use coordinating colors with my blocks. So I ended up with a lot of different threads, and some of them were much easier to work with than others. There was one thread, thankfully I only had one white square, but for some reason my white thread was horrible. It just kept knotting up. I could not get it to, if you're getting a lot of knots and you pull the thread through slower, you can usually alleviate some of the tangling. But even when I did that, this white thread would not work. It just kept getting caught or tangled up. And I tried using beeswax on it to kind of give it a little bit of a coating. It still was just terrible. So if you are working with a thread that seems to tangle a lot, I would highly recommend just switching out to another thread. So that is just, my point is to kind of know your threads. So some of my threads I had to work with much slower than others. Some of them I could pull the knots through or the thread through much faster. And some of them I had to relax more often. But if you kind of just know your thread, it helps to alleviate a lot of these knots as well. So one thing I haven't talked about is finishing off the thread. Now I've made it all the way around here, so I just want to tie off my thread. Now there might be a better way to do this, but I'm just doing a stitch right on top of my last stitch and then coming back up through one more time, and then I'm just going to go ahead and bury the thread. I want to start the needle right where I left off that last stitch, and then I'm just going to feed it through between the layers again in a nice long stitch, pull it through, and then I can just cut off the thread. And that section is completed. So I'm all finished with the quilting, and I just wanted to show you a couple things on the back of my quilt. Here's one of the little knots that I decided just to live with. And you can see that my stitching is far from perfect, but I've evaluated the whole back of the quilt, and I did find one spot where I really gathered up the backing in the back of the material here. So on this one part, I am going to have to pull out the stitches and requilt right here, but everything else looks pretty uniform. So I'll go ahead and flip the quilt over and show you the quilt from the front side. So here's the front of the quilt. It's hard to get it all laid out flat down here in my little craft room, but you can see all the texture that is added by the hand quilting. And like I said, this does take a fair amount of time. I estimate that I spent easily over 100 hours doing all this hand quilting, but it was a fun project for me. Like I said, it's kind of meditative work for me. And the other thing I will mention is that you want to be sure you have really good lighting, especially on these darker blocks. It can be pretty hard to see if you don't have some really good lighting. So that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and be sure to check back for the final video in this series when I'll be finishing off the edges with some binding.